on Zoom webinar, but it is also live streamed on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. It is hosted by the Consortium on Democracy and Disinformation in partnership with Rappler. My name is John Neri. I write for the Philippine Daily Inquirer, and I'm a convener of the consortium. And it is my happy task to serve as a co-moderator.
Good morning and welcome everyone. My name is Maria Ressa. I'm editor-at-large of Rappler, and I'm really delighted to serve as co-moderator of the forum. We expect the Manila Regional Trial Court to start on time. That's about 35 minutes. So let's get started, and let me first introduce our distinguished panel of journalists and lawyers. I'll start with Peter. Peter Greste is a veteran foreign correspondent, formerly with the BBC, Reuters, and Al Jazeera. He was detained in an Egyptian jail for 400 days for doing good journalism. He holds the UNESCO Chair in Journalism and Communication at the University of Queensland. He's joining us from Brisbane. Good morning, Peter.
Good morning. It's fantastic to be here and joining you.
Next, I'll introduce Anne-Marie Lipinski. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, a former editor-in-chief of the Chicago Tribune, and a former chair of the Pulitzer Board. Since 2011, Anne-Marie has served as the curator of the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard University. She's joining us from Cambridge, Massachusetts. Good evening, Anne-Marie. Welcome to our forum.
Good evening, and thank you for hosting this.
I'd like to introduce next Queen's Counsel Kealan Gallagher. She's a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers, specializing in human rights and civil liberties. She leads the international legal team for the family of Daphne Caruana Galizia, the journalist assassinated in Malta in 2017. And together with Amal Clooney, she leads another team of international lawyers serving as counsel to Maria Ressa. She joins us from London, where it's just past midnight. Good morning, Kealan. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, and thank you very much for hosting this important forum today.
And here in Manila, we are joined by one of the country's preeminent lawyers. Jose Manuel, or popularly known as Chel Jokno, is the longtime chair of the Free Legal Assistance Group, a nationwide organization of human rights lawyers, and founding dean of the De La Salle University College of Law. He has closely followed Maria Ressa's cases from the start. Good morning, Chel. Welcome to the forum.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Peter, Anne-Marie, Kealan, and Chel for making time for this forum. We have a special guest joining us from the courthouse, Manila Regional Trial Court 46, our good friend, dear colleague, Maria Ressa. Maria, unmute first. The government has been trying to mute you this time. Let's unmute.
Unmute. Hi, yeah. Sorry about that. We're waiting outside the courtroom. Ted is next to me. We're trying to follow social distancing or physical distancing. And then Ray, we are really a test case of everything. Here's what the courtroom looks like. We get to go in at 8 o'clock. You know, there are three reporters. This is what they look like behind me. John, and then you have here. We're about to go in. Thank you, guys. Thank you. We'll let you know as soon as I think any of the three. I see Leon, Howard, and Anjo. Oh yes, Anjo. So those are the three reporters with us today. Ray, how do you feel?
Nervous. But yeah, we're ready.
And Ted, look at Ted. Ted is being a lawyer.
Hey everybody. Hey John.
Hey Ted.
Tell us how we do this. Thank you, guys. We're gonna go off to go inside.
Good luck, Maria.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. That was Ray Santos Jr. with her. She's the other co-accused in the cyber libel case. She also mentioned the three reporters who, I guess, drew the the right tickets in the lottery and are covering the courtroom. That's Howard Johnson of the BBC, Anjo Alimario of CNN Philippines, and Rappler's own Lian Buan. Of course, that was also Ted Te, a counsel for Maria. I want to thank our audience. We have to apologize. Our Zoom webinar can only accommodate 500 participants. Last night, we had to turn off the registration page because we got about 800 applications. So we are waiting for everyone to come in. However, this is being live streamed on the Rappler page in Facebook, on Rappler's Twitter account, and on Rappler's channel in YouTube. So everyone else can follow through the live stream. I also want to say thank you to our many partners, especially those who are hosting watch parties. A special shout out to the Foundation for Media Alternatives, the Free the Artist movement, and our co-conveners Gang Badoy and Jane Ulmatiao, and Pinoy Ako Blog, all for hosting watch parties of our forum. I know we're all excited to start the discussion. Just a quick guide to our house rules. First, please use the Q&A button, not the chat, for asking questions. That is one major difference with Zoom webinar from the regular Zoom interface. Please use the Q&A button for the questions. Second, our forum will be divided into 3 parts. We'll spend about 15 or so minutes laying the factual basis for the case and the global perception of the case. Second, we'll spend about 35-40 minutes talking about the implications and consequences of the case and any of the possible outcomes. And then last, maybe the last 30 minutes, we will be fielding questions from the floor. We will be culling the best ones or the similar ones, and we'll raise them with our resource persons. And third and last house rule, we have 2 monitors. I don't think we would need them, but just in case, we have 2 monitors who are patrolling our chat room and our Q&A box, looking out for unruly conduct and abusive language. So we want to focus on the issues. Okay, I think we're ready. Marites?
Yes, the first question goes to our lawyer, Chel Jokno. Maybe just a snapshot of the case, the factual basis, and how did we even get here, Chel?
Well, it's been a long, convoluted journey to get here with a lot of twists and turns. I'll try to do justice to that, to what happened. Well, it all began way back on May 29, 2012, when Rappler published an article about the ongoing, at the time, impeachment trial of then Chief Justice Renato Corona. The article was entitled, CJ Using SUVs of Controversial Businessmen. And the CJ referred to in the title was then Chief Justice Corona. The article revolved around the impeachment trial, but really it was focused on the penchant of the then Chief Justice for using vehicles that did not belong to him, that were registered in the names of other individuals, including Wilfredo Keng. The article cited a 2002 intelligence report that Rappler had obtained, which described Keng as a naturalized Filipino citizen who had been under surveillance by the National Security Council for alleged involvement in illegal activities. It also said that Keng was involved in a murder case for which he was never jailed, and that he was supposedly close to lawmakers and had contacts with the US Embassy. At the time the article was published in 2012, the only law that penalized libel was found in the revised penal code, which was passed way back in 1935. But later in 2012, in September of that year, the Philippine Congress passed a Cybercrime Prevention Act that increased the penalty for libel that was online, and that also recognized corporate liability for libel. Soon after this law took effect in October, however, there were many groups that questioned it before the Supreme Court, so the Supreme Court issued a temporary restraining order. And until the case was decided in 2014, that temporary restraining order was in effect. Eventually, in February 11, 2014, the court declared the law, most of the law, constitutional, and said that with respect to the cyber libel, that that provision was valid and constitutional with respect to the original author of the post, but not with respect to others who simply receive the post or react to it. On February 19, 2014, Rappler updated its original report, which mentioned the Wilfredo Keng, but only by correcting the spelling of one word, evasion, and adding some modifications to the URL of the images. So nothing substantially was changed in the article itself. We fast forward to 3 years later, July 2017, the president now is Duterte. He issues a State of the Nation address where he mentions Rappler and says that Rappler is fully owned by Americans. Soon after that, a week later, Rappler received its first subpoena, and then that became a barrage of cases then ensued. Cases filed with the Securities and Exchange Commission, with the tax court. This case of cyber libel came soon after. That was in October 2017 that Wilfredo Keng, 5 years after the article was originally published, filed a cyber libel complaint with the National Bureau of Investigation here in the Philippines. Maria Ressa, and the case was against Maria Ressa and Reynaldo Santos. And they answered the complaint. They said that you can't apply the cybercrime prevention law retroactively, and the offense had already prescribed, because under the revised penal code, you only have 1 year to file the lawsuit. While the NBI had initially said that they were going to dismiss the case because it had already prescribed, they later reversed and said they would proceed with the filing. So they brought the case to the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice eventually filed charges against Ressa, Maria Ressa, Ray Santos, and Rappler. That is in January 2019. And from there, of course, the case was filed in court. A trial then ensued. Today is the promulgation of judgment. That's it in a nutshell.
Thank you, Chell. As you said, convoluted legal proceeding. We'll have a chance to go back and discuss some of the details later. I'd like to bring in Anne-Marie at this point and ask her about international reception of the case. I mean, is the rest of the world, in fact, paying attention to this case?
Emphatically so. I think that's very important for people in the Philippines to know. Maria and Rappler have been the subjects of extensive media and political attention well beyond your country. The U.S. Senate has condemned these legal charges and, in fact, asked that they be dropped. She, as I'm sure you know, was a Time Magazine Person of the Year. She's been the subject of many magazine and television profiles, 60 Minutes, the New York Times, the Washington Post. She's been honored by the Committee to Protect Journalists, which monitors abuses of journalists worldwide. She's been asked to speak at dozens of college campuses. She was the commencement speaker recently at Princeton, at her alma mater, specifically so they could bring attention and focus to her and this case. Reporters Without Borders featured her in this International Commission on Information and Democracy, which she and I and others work on. What has happened in her case and what will happen today has resonated and will continue to resonate far beyond the Philippines. I think this case comes at a time when there are just extraordinary pressures on journalists around the world. And Maria's case, but also Maria's extraordinary articulation of what's at stake with this case, have really captured the attention, I think, not just of the industry, but of people concerned about a free press and about free speech throughout the world. Amal Clooney, who works with you and has been working on the legal case, published in the Washington Post this weekend, and she wrote, "If Maria is convicted and locked up for doing her work, the message to other journalists and independent voices is clear: keep quiet or you will be next." And I think what is so important about what she wrote is that it is not just a case that journalists should be worried about. It is one that anybody who's concerned about free speech anywhere should be concerned about.
So since this case has really gotten international attention, I'd like to ask the first question for Kealan. So what is the role of international lawyers? Because you and Amal are involved in this case.
Yes, myself and Amal lead the international legal team, acting for Maria Ressa. And the reason for that really is that what is happening to Maria is not only deeply concerning as a matter of Philippines law, as Chell has so brilliantly explained, it's also gravely concerning as a matter of international law. So as international lawyers, we consider legal avenues to vindicate Maria's rights on the international plane, and we work very closely with her expert team in the Philippines, her domestic team. But what Maria faces, as Chell outlined, is a succession of cases that seek to criminalize her reporting, expose her in total to almost 100 years in prison. That's the potential maximum sentence when you add together the accumulation of everything she faces. That includes 2 libel prosecutions, 2 criminal cases alleging illegal foreign ownership in her company, spurious investigations of old tax returns. As many of you will know, at one stage Rappler's operating license was revoked. Rappler has even been vilified in presidential press conferences, and Maria herself has received horrific misogynistic rape threats, death threats online, simply for doing her job, simply for being a journalist. And the combination of those things is what the Filipino National Union of Journalists has described as a barrage of lawsuits revealing a shameless act of persecution by a bully government. That's their quote. And we think individually and cumulatively, what we're seeing here is a flagrant breach of multiple rights of Maria's, protected by international treaties which the Philippines have ratified. But critically also, as Anne-Marie has made this point also, it's also fundamental breaches of audience rights, the rights of audiences to hear the stories that are being told. And it's also a challenge to the rule of law in the Philippines. But I've got to emphasize that this is not only Maria and Rappler, the co-defendants today. There is a well-documented pattern of attacks on independent voices in the Philippines, which has raised alarm internationally. The Philippines ranked 134th in the 2019 World Press Freedom Index. It ranks at the very top of the impunity index, measuring journalist murders that have gone unpunished. Reporters Without Borders, RSF, found that 3 Filipino journalists killed in 2019 were most likely, I'm quoting from them, most likely by agents working for local politicians who can have reporters silenced with complete impunity. That's an expert group. I sit on their UK board, and that's the language that they've used about what is happening in the Philippines to journalists. And for me, it seems being a journalist, being an investigative journalist, an independent journalist in the Philippines is an act of bravery when you look at that backdrop. We've also seen deeply concerning language. So Duterte, for example, has been openly contemptuous of journalists. His former campaign spokesperson called them prostitutes. And he gave this quote at one stage. He said, "Just because you're a journalist, you're not exempted from assassination." And we, of course, are having this discussion only weeks after ABS, CBN went dark. So that's the context and the deeply concerning context. But I should also say, echoing what Anne-Marie said, the importance of this case, of course, goes far beyond the Philippines. And that's why, as you've heard, the world is watching. The US Senate you've heard about, the UK Foreign Secretary, the UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, David Kay, has filed an amicus brief in this case precisely because of those concerns. And it seems to us on our team that this is an emblematic case globally for a number of reasons, both because of the innovative nature of Rappler's online model and Maria's focus on challenging disinformation, one of the pandemics we now face, but also because this case involves multiple attacks in multiple ways. And that is particularly difficult for us as human rights lawyers to tackle. In some ways, it's much simpler to deal with a straightforward case which involves a single charge under a terrorism law, or a single charge under a libel law or a cyber libel law. But it's far more difficult when you are dealing with attacks on multiple fronts in the way that Maria and Rappler have been. So our enemy is sophisticated, and we have to be sophisticated in our response.
Thank you, Kealan. We'll have a chance to respond to your points as well as the points of Anne-Marie. But let me bring Peter Greste in. When we were conceptualizing this forum, he was the very first person on our list, partly because he's a friend of the consortiums, but also partly because he has been on the receiving end of state harassment. He was a guest of the Egyptian government for 400 days. My question for Peter is, does Maria's case give you a sense of deja vu? Sorry, Peter, unmute.
Sorry about that, John. Yes, deja vu is really hardly the word for it. I had a rather sleepless night last night just recalling the day that I faced my verdict in our terrorism trial in Egypt. And so I identified very, very strongly with what Maria is going through at this point. We'd come through a fairly lengthy 6-month trial, detention and trial. And I think we'd done a lot of calculations about the way that the case might go. It was plain to anyone who watched that there was absolutely no evidence to convict us, as there is really, I think, as we've just heard, no substantial evidence, no reason to convict Maria. But we thought, look, our case had received such strong international attention that the court, if it wanted to have any self-respect, it could only possibly acquit us. It could only let us go. But then we also felt, well, politically that might be a bit difficult for the court to do. So we thought perhaps we'd get a conviction, but we'd already spent a substantial amount of time in prison, about 6 months at that point. And so we thought perhaps we'd get time served, or maybe a week, maybe a month or more in prison, just to kind of justify the whole farce of the trial. And so when we went into the case, I think we were all feeling really quite confident and looking forward to getting out. We had resisted and failed the urge to make plans for what we would do on the day that we were, the day after the hearing. And I remember when we were finally convicted and the judge read our sentence out for 7 years in prison. That was one hell of a hammer blow. It took me quite a long time to recover from that. So again, I don't want to draw too many parallels between what happened to us in Egypt, I think, and what's happening to Maria. I think there is evidence that the court in the Philippines is a little bit more independent than the court was in Egypt. But to suggest that there is no political pressure in this case, that the judge is not going to be aware of the politics in this, I think would be incredibly naive. It's quite clear that the government, or the government's position on this case, they've made it abundantly clear that they don't believe Maria should be free. We've seen, as we've already heard, a fairly substantial, a brutally substantial campaign of legal harassment, lawfare, I think, as Maria has called it in the past. And so the judge will be acutely aware of the pressure. I wouldn't want to anticipate the verdict, but I know exactly how I felt, that mix of anticipation, of fear, of anxiety, but also I think a certain amount of pride at what we were defending, not just ourselves, but the principles of press freedom. And so it's going to be a very difficult few hours, I think, for Maria coming up.
Thank you, Peter. I have a question for Chell and Kealan. Peter, described his feelings about the court case in Egypt in partly in this way, that if the Egyptian court had a healthy sense of self-respect, they would acquit. I think that Judge Estacio, sorry, I forget her name. Montesa, sorry. I found out that she's in fact an international lecturer on cybercrime. So I hope that she would also be possessed of a healthy sense of self-respect. But at the same time, Peter also pointed out that it is incredibly naive not to imagine that there is no political pressure. So my question for Chel and then Kealan, what is the path forward for a judge like her to rule with a healthy sense of self-respect despite political pressure?
Well, it's not. Of course, we like to think that we have an independent judiciary, but that is more of an ideal than a reality. The reason is because the judiciary has also been the subject of attacks by this administration. I recall the very first drug narco list that the president announced way back in 2016 included the name of a judge who had long been dead. But imagine the effect on living judges at that time. They must have thought, if a dead judge's name can get on that list, then I could easily get on that list. That was followed, of course, by the removal of the Chief Justice Sereno, not through impeachment as required by the Constitution, but by a co-warrant of proceeding decided by her court. And I think that has really eroded the administration and the independence of justice in the country. Now, what effect that has on this particular judge, we really can't say. We have had several judges who have been very courageous, who have came out with decisions that where they knew would not be liked by this administration. But it's something that we'll have to wait and see as far as this particular judge is concerned.
Thank you. Kealan?
Yes, thank you, John. So for us, it's critically important that the judge today, Judge Renelda Estacio Montesa, demonstrates that she's complying with her judicial oath, that she's complying with the rule of law, and that she's complying with both the requirements of Filipino law and the requirements of international law, including treaties to which the Philippines is a party. And in our view, if she makes an independent decision which is compliant with those standards, there is only one outcome, and that's an acquittal. And here we are watching to see whether she does that. And we are hoping that that's the message we get from the court today, and that we see an independent and fair, compliant with the rule of law decision from the court, which stands up to the bullies and to the others condemned by so many that we've spoken about already today.
Thank you. Maybe one last question on the facts from Marites, maybe for Peter and Anne-Marie.
Oh, on the facts of the case? Sorry. No, anyway, Peter, you've been following this, and why is it important, aside, to you and your students? You're teaching journalism now. So I think this is, as Kealan said, is emblematic of bigger problems in the Philippines. But why is it important to you and your journalism students?
Thanks, Maria. It's an important case, and as we've already been discussing, it's important because it tests the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary within the Philippines. As we've already heard, it would be very difficult for anybody taking a clear, dispassionate look at the facts of the case to come to any other conclusion that Maria is innocent. And so this isn't just about Maria Ressa and Rappler and all those who are defending themselves in this case, all of those who are on trial, but it is very much about the system. The system is on trial. It also is a test of the ability of journalists to work without overbearing legal constraints, because if we see a conviction in this case, it will have very serious legal implications for anybody who goes online, journalists, for people who make comments on Twitter and Facebook and so on. The way the cyber libel law is framed and the way that it has been exercised in this case, I think places anybody who is making public statements at a great deal of very serious risk. But it does affect journalists in particular because this is the other test of this case within the Philippines. It's a test of media freedom. A conviction would send a clear message to every journalist operating in the Philippines that if you push the government, they'll use every tool to come after you, and the courts can't or won't defend you. And so on those levels, on all of those levels, it's really key within the Philippines. But we also need to understand its significance internationally. Again, as I think Anne-Marie was pointing out, it is a test of an international test of respect for the rule of law. Now, I know that there has been a lot of interest, as Anne-Marie mentioned, from the US Senate. We've seen the British Foreign Office keeping track on this and so on. But we also know that a lot of big democracies like Australia and the United States have been, I think, less than robust in standing up for violations of press freedom around the world. And if we see a conviction in this case without a serious pushback from the White House, from Canberra, from London, from other democracies around the world, it will be a very clear signal, not just to the Philippines, but to other states who are limiting press freedom across the region, that they can get away with it, that they can crack down on journalists with relative impunity, that there is no big price to pay. Freedom House, in its latest report, said political rights and civil liberties declined overall in Asia as authoritarian rulers showed their disdain for democratic values. So a conviction, I think, confirms that trend. It supports that trend. It allows a rollback of these really key democratic principles, not just within the Philippines, but across the region. A free press is often the last bulwark against authoritarianism. Once parliamentary checks and balances have been subverted, once courts are compliant, a free press is really all that remains. And that, I think, is why authoritarians tend to go after the media, because it really does challenge their power. And so this is why this case is so critical on so many levels.
Thank you, Peter. I do have one last question for Anne-Marie on the factual basis of this case, and it has to do with the journalism that is in question here. Anne-Marie, you've been a long time journalist. This particular article, which came out in 2012, was based on a government intelligence document. It named the businessman who has filed this case, together with others, as it described them as controversial businessmen. That is the main allegation here of this businessman, that he has been unfairly, maliciously defamed. Do you think that, in fact, this is defamatory to him, that this is not good journalism?
I think it is the phrase that you just described, John, would be a common characterization based on the facts of the research and of the investigation. It is something you can find in investigative reporting around the world, pretty much any day of the week. I think what's clear here is it sort of taxes one's questions credulity to conclude that this is a case about that story. No matter what happens today, Maria and Rappler face how many more, Kealan, how many more charges? How many more times is she likely to appear in court, even if she's victorious today? This is obviously focusing on a phrase like that, which is benign and common in investigative reporting, elevating it to a very, very serious charge. And oh, by the way, there are 8 or 9 other cases pending against the same journalists and the same news organization. This is clearly a stretch and an effort to silence a strong journalist, founder of an independent news organization in the Philippines, by a government that brooks no criticism. So one can talk about the details of that particular story or this particular case, but I think we all know that's not what we're talking about here.
Thank you, Anne-Marie.
John, can I just point out something about the story?
Yes, please, Marites.
Wilfredo Keng was interviewed. His side was in the story. So anyway, that's one of the key points here, is that he knew about the story. His side was taken. So it's like as if 5 years later, he wakes up and said, oh, I'm in this story. And then he files a case. But anyway, Anne-Marie's right. There's the big picture. And we are not in a good place at this time with a populist and authoritarian leader. Okay, John, go.
Okay, sure. So Anne-Marie, Kealan, and Peter have already referenced the international perceptions about the case. Let's talk about the implications and consequences of the case, both in the Philippines and abroad. My question is for Kealan. Kealan, you lead the international legal team for the case involving Daphne Caruana Galizia. How does that case, or how does Maria's case, differ from a case like the Maltese journalist?
Thank you, John. Well, Daphne Caruana Galizia, I'm sure many of those listening will know, was assassinated in a car bomb in October 2017, simply for doing her job, for being a journalist, and an extremely good one at that. And Daphne's death was deeply shocking in many ways. It was a brutal murder in a European country, and Malta lost the voice of a journalist often referred to as their conscience, who'd broken every major story in Malta since 1988, when she was in her early 20s and had 3 very young boys, one of whom was still in nappies. And since then, she had been at the vanguard of investigative journalism in Malta, and she'd done superb work internationally, including with the Panama Papers. So it was very shocking. But the language that's used about Daphne's case often suggests that it was a bolt from the blue. And we on our team, working with the bereaved family, emphasised that that is simply not correct, because in many ways it wasn't shocking and it was not a surprise. And it followed 3 decades of Daphne being harassed and abused in multiple ways, and there have been various attempts to silence her. And if anyone wants to listen to it, and I can post it in the chat, 10 days before her assassination, she spoke to the Council of Europe about her life and what it had become. And she described arson attacks on her home, attempts to cut off her income, facing multiple libel suits, including criminal libel suits, freezing of her bank accounts, vile misogynistic attacks online, critics in the street calling her a witch. And she said, you get used to it like a scar forms round a wound. So Daphne set out in her own words the danger she was in, and then 10 days later she was dead. So it was not a bolt from the blue. This was a preventable death. It followed years of state-sanctioned harassment, and it took place in a culture of impunity. And I'm afraid when I look at the papers in Maria's case, I see many chilling similarities with the material I'm looking at posthumously in Daphne Caruana Galizia's case. And it's very shocking. And if you listen to that interview, you will see there are so many parallels with Maria's case, including the death by 1,000 cuts strategy of attempting to silence someone in multiple different ways. And I'll just give you a couple of quotes which just illustrate the links. So one of the things which Daphne said was, in just 1 year, there were 380 vile posts about me online, more than one a day. And of course, President Duterte has helped to amplify online attacks against Maria Ressa. And at one point, they reached a rate of 90 hate messages per hour. And the language, when I look at those messages, is so similar to the language used in the messages that were targeted at Daphne. And Daphne compared her life to Arthur Miller's play, The Crucible, about the persecution of women as witches in the 17th century, saying, you watch it and you think, Madonna, this is like Malta, but with different clothes. And if you watch it, I think you can see it's like the Philippines, but with different clothes in many ways. But also here, There are differences also, of course. I'm speaking at quite a high level. But here, in many ways, the threats that Maria and other independent voices in the Philippines face from President Duterte are far less subtle. You know, that quote that I had earlier, indicating risk of assassination, there was nothing like that emanating from the Maltese government. It was far more subtle than that. And that goes to a point Peter made earlier about chilling effect. And that is that this is part of a deliberate strategy where the authorities want journalists to be afraid in the Philippines. They want the comparison to be drawn. And the threat is part of the pattern of silencing independent voices. And it's that chilling effect that Peter was speaking about earlier. I've got to say, John, that I do also, of course, see similarities between Maria's case and many others around the world. Anne-Marie referred earlier, and Peter referred to the very wide and deep threats that journalists are facing at the moment. Journalists worldwide are facing growing threats to their work, to their safety, to their liberty, and often their lives. And Article 19 in a recent report said journalism is more dangerous and more under threat than at any point in the last decade. And the threats are multifaceted. But I should say, this isn't a trend confined to dictatorships or oppressive regimes, of course. The World Press Freedom Index, compiled by RSF, evaluates the state of journalism in 180 countries and territories worldwide each year. And the most recent one, the 2019 index, shows the creation of an intense climate of fear for journalists, fueled by a hostility towards journalists expressed by political leaders in many countries, including some of the world's largest democracies. And of course, many of us will recall that the President of the United States of America has called journalists the enemy of the people. And that language is then echoed by leaders such as President Duterte in the Philippines, Putin in Russia, Moreno in Ecuador. And that language deeply concerns me. So one of the comparisons I do want to just flag is that Maria's case is deeply shocking and very extreme and such an important case for the world to watch. But many of the themes we see in what Maria is facing and what Rappler is facing are echoed across the world in many countries. And it's critical that we remember that and we think about the similarities between Maria's case and others. And it's why the message which goes from the court today is so critical for other independent voices in other countries. The message it sends to Egypt, to Iran, to Turkey is critical.
Thank you, Kealan.
John, could I?
If the court starts on time, then the promulgation will be underway. Marites, yes, please.
Yes, I was going to actually ask Anne to zoom out because, as Kealan said, there's attacks against journalists in many parts of the world, even in the US, Anne. So is this a crisis point for journalists all over the world?
I would say it's a crisis point for democracy in many parts of the world. Yes, for journalism, but it's important to remember that journalism is in service of a larger mission and ideal, and that's what's really at risk here. And I think just to underscore what Kealan was saying, you know, in the US, in the last fewer than 3 weeks, there have been about 400 cases of arrests, harassment, violence against journalists, covering the police, the protests in the United States, the protests against police violence. It is unprecedented in our lifetime, that kind of an action. And it is spread across more than 30 states. So these are not isolated parts of the country where we're experiencing this. Around the world, we are seeing quickly enacted regulations and sanctions against journalists covering coronavirus. So we have a global pandemic, and we are neutering and muting and handicapping journalists who are trying to cover the most important public health story of the century. And so new legislation that limits journalist movements, bans public health officials in some parts of the world from talking to reporters, criminalizes an effort to, tarnish the reputation of a government. And what I think is of great concern is how long will these stay enacted? And is this a temporary action, or are these regulations that journalists will have to deal with now for all time? They, in many parts of the world, we know these are unlikely to be rolled back. This, of course, is taking place against this backdrop, as we've been discussing, of extraordinary pressures around the world. Mexico killing record numbers of journalists with impunity, Turkey jailing record numbers of journalists, Viktor Orban's methodical closing down, silencing of a free press in Hungary, journalists in Putin's Russia who have less freedom of expression than they have since the fall of the Soviet Union. Venezuela, China, Saudi Arabia, where officials sought and succeeded in actually murdering a journalist whose opinions they wanted to silence. And I am not, just trying to make this a problem elsewhere in the world. It is a problem in my own country. And so when we have the leader of the country and the leader of the free world attacking journalists as the enemy of the people, giving succor to leaders around the globe who would do the same, it is a moment I've not experienced in my career, nor any journalists of my generation in this country have experienced, and it's a dangerous trend that needs to be arrested, and not just in this country, but around the world.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. I have one more question for Chell, and after that, we will take the question. We will read the questions from the floor. Chell, speaking of implications, what are the possible legal outcomes of this cyber libel case? Unmute.
Yeah. It's very black and white. Either the judge will acquit the accused or convict them. And as far as that goes, the imposable penalty would range from anywhere from 6 months and 1 day to 7 years imprisonment, if the judge would choose to do that. Of course, the judge would have the discretion to impose a fine rather than imprisonment. But it's very hard to predict what will be on the mind of the judge as far as the penalties are concerned. In the Philippines, we don't have a separate sentencing phase. So the sentence is announced when the conviction, if ever that comes out, is promulgated. Right now, it's probably maybe they're in the middle of reading the decision as we are holding this forum.
I have a follow-up. Can I ask a follow-up from Chell? Yes. Chell, if it's guilty, there is an appeal process. Is there?
Well, first, the accused can file a motion for reconsideration with the same court. If that is denied, then an appeal can be brought to the higher courts. So this is not the end of it yet. There is, even if the decision is adverse, it's still a long way before any judgment becomes final.
And Chell, even if the businessman, the government loses, the businessman Wilfredo can still appeal?
Well, if the government loses, the double jeopardy will probably apply. So the government will not be able to appeal at least the criminal aspect of the case.
Just one more question about legal outcomes. Is it possible for a conviction and then deny bail?
Typically, for this type of case, the courts are very liberal in terms of granting bail on appeal. But given the political context and given what has been happening to Maria and how the law has been weaponized in the country, it's not beyond the possibility that issue of bail will be, the question of bail will be denied by the court. That's something that we in the legal community are really looking at, because it's a question. For example, let me talk about the specific example. Imelda Marcos, after she was convicted of 7 counts of graft involving so much money, was granted bail on appeal, and she's been out on bail ever since she was convicted. But there have also been cases where persons were not given bail on appeal. So we are really closely monitoring that aspect of this case as well.
Thank you. So we have many questions in our Q&A box. Marites and I will be reading off from the box. What I'd like to do is we will specify who we want to answer. We're not going to ask everyone to answer a particular question. That way we'll be able to field as many questions as we have time for. So the first question is specifically for Peter, from an anonymous attendee. Do these kinds of attacks happen to male journalists as well? In Peter's case, did he experience the same amount of vile and violent hate messages?
Maria's case, I think, highlights the vulnerability that female journalists in particular are facing. The online attacks, the abuse, the sexism, the misogyny, the threats of rape have been absolutely staggering. And I think they really underscore just how much more pressure female journalists are under. That's not to diminish the pressure that male journalists are under, but typically we just don't see the kind of online abuse that Maria has been facing, and that so many other journalists who are doing controversial work have to deal with. I wish it weren't the case. I think it is shocking, and I think it's also an incredibly sad reflection on the mentality of those that are launching the attacks, that they're attacking the person rather than the issue, the subject of the work. I think it's terribly, it's I don't know, I mean, I'm lost for words in trying to describe it adequately, but there's no doubt that Maria and other females, other women journalists have been the subject of unconscionable assaults that males just aren't subject to.
Thank you.
There's
John, could I say something very? Oh, John, could I say something very quick on that point? Which just is, as Peter has indicated on that issue, online abuse of and threats to female journalists, that's a global phenomenon. And surveys routinely show that female journalists and television news presenters receive about 3 times as much abuse as their male counterparts. And more than a quarter of instances of intimidation against female journalists take place online. And actually, interestingly, female journalists covering technology are subjected to heightened levels of abuse. But they are global figures, global stats. So Peter's quite right that what we see with Maria is indicative of a broader and deeply concerning trend.
Thank you.
There's a question for Chel Jokno. It's about the Philippines anti-terror law, which is which will be signed by President Duterte. What is the effect of this anti-terror law on press freedom? So I think, Chel, you can answer that. Please unmute.
Sorry. There is a very strong impact of the anti-terror bill on freedom of speech. The law creates a new crime called inciting to terrorism, very similar to the crimes we are familiar with, inciting to sedition and inciting to rebellion. So it's essentially a speech crime. And the concern that we have is that it can easily be used to go after critics of the administration. Because the definition of terrorism in the law is so nebulous, it's so vague that it could easily encompass members of the opposition and anyone who dares to criticize this government. The issue of inciting to sedition, for example, has affected me personally. I've been charged with that by this government together with others who ran in the last elections, only to be told later on by the Department of Justice that there was absolutely no evidence to support the case. And historically in the Philippines, inciting to sedition has been used since the Spanish colonial times to go after critics of the administration. So once this bill is signed, I don't know if the president has already signed the bill, we can anticipate that cases of inciting to terrorism will be filed.
Thank you, Chel. My next question is for Anne-Marie. This actually was a question about Philippine journalism, but I want to expand it. This is from Benedict Magsino. Is the whole concept of freedom of the press still relevant? Has the mission of journalists as watchdogs of democracy changed since the election of authoritarian leaders?
It is not irrelevant, much as authoritarian leaders would like to make it so. And I think that's the very fight and the struggle that we're talking about today, and that Maria and Rappler represent. I think in times like this, when you face authoritarian governments, journalism becomes ever more important, not less. And of course, the efforts to silence journalists become ever more strenuous. So that's the tension that we're experiencing, and that's exactly what this case is about. Maria's case and Rappler's case, and what is going to be decided today, is it's kind of a poster child for this very issue. And that's why that's really why it's getting so much attention, because these kinds of this kind of stress on democracy is at play in so many other countries. And how this case resolves is going to provide a bit of a textbook, I think, for a lot of other people. But no matter what happens today, that is not a sign that press freedom is an outmoded notion. It can and should and must remain vital.
Thank you.
Yeah, there's a question for Kealan. I think Kealan can answer this. It's from Lydia Brown. She's asking if there is a conviction today, can other countries, are there sanctions that can be imposed on the Philippines based on international treaties the Philippines has signed?
Yes, so that's one of the things that we'll be looking at very carefully once we've got the ruling. So it will depend, of course, on the decision and on the reasoning, but we will immediately be looking at what we can do in the international sphere, whether we will need to go to one of the UN bodies, for example, and there are steps which can be taken internationally. So as well as Chel has said, the right of appeal domestically, and that is something we'll need to look at very carefully and work very closely with the domestic team. So the short answer is yes, and we will be considering that.
Thank you. The next question is for Kealan and Chel. This is from Happy. It's a happy question. Can we file a case against the Philippine government for making libelous statements about Maria and Rappler, saying it's owned by the CIA or foreign-owned?
Chel, did you want to go first, or?
Go ahead, Kealan.
Yeah, well, a happy question. I wasn't expecting many of those today. I don't think many of us are feeling happy on this incredibly worrying morning. The quick thing I would say is that Maria, like so many journalists, would never dream of using a draconian law to silence other voices and turning into precisely the opposite of what she stands for and her values. And this is a case where you don't fight fire with fire. And in fact, people often use the phrase fight fire with fire. And of course, as we all know, you should in fact fight fire with water. And it seems to me this is a really obvious example where, in fact, Maria and others would not want to use these types of laws to challenge and silence others who criticize them, even if technically they could.
Thank you. Chel?
Yeah, I agree with Kealan's point. If ever cases are filed, not cyber and libel, I think, but it is possible to file damage suits. It is possible to file other criminal cases against those who have maligned Rappler and Maria. However, as far as the president is concerned, we have a doctrine recognized by the courts of presidential immunity from suit. So he could not be sued until after he gets out of the palace. That issue was, in fact, was raised in the recent case of Senator Laila de Lima, where we had filed a petition for habeas data against the president for his slut shaming of her, for his misogynistic remarks and all of that. But just recently, the Supreme Court said that he's immune from suit, and that actually dismissed our petition. So that's pending reconsideration with the court.
Thank you, Chel.
You do have still time for questions.
Yes.
There's a question here related to the earlier question, but it's an anonymous sender. He or she is asking, is there an international court wherein leaders of countries can be sued for violating human rights? So I think Kealan and Chel can answer this. But I'm sorry, meantime, there's a pending case in the International Criminal Court, not case, information filed against Duterte in the International Criminal Court. So go ahead, Kealan, and then Chel. Unmute.
Sorry, yeah, thank you. Apologies for the slight delay. Yes, there are ways in which the Philippines government can be taken to court, and indeed that has happened before. And those of you who've seen my colleague Amal Clooney's opinion piece in the Washington Post will see that there's a link there, in fact, to an earlier decision relating to the Philippines, where the Philippines was very sharply criticized for criminalization of libel and for imprisoning people for allegedly libelous speech. So we already have a situation where the Philippines government has been found to be in violation of international treaties which it has ratified and which apply to the Philippines as a matter of international law. So we already have a very clear precedent in which applies to this case. And it is clear as a matter of international law that decriminalization of libel is essential, and that imprisonment for allegedly libelous speech is not human rights compliant. And that's already been decided at international level. And regrettably, what we have in this statute and what we have in this particular case is a clear breach of that principle.
Thank you, Kealan. My question is for Peter. This is from another distinguished journalist, Julie Posetti. Peter, based on your experience, how important is local and international resistance from colleagues in journalism? How important will it be to keep that focus on the 7 other cases Maria is facing, even if she's difficult to do?
It's hugely important for a number of reasons. At a personal level, knowing that you've got the backing of your colleagues is massively empowering. For me, it was one of the key things in surviving that period of imprisonment. It made me feel as though I wasn't doing it on my own, that I had the backing of others, but also that I was standing up for something that was bigger than just myself, that I was there as a representative of all journalism. And so it was massively important for me at a personal level. But I think also politically, what it does is maintain the pressure on our politicians and diplomats to do the right thing, to push back as well. It provides the kind of political top cover that they need to make some very robust representations, to push back, to take the kinds of steps necessary to make it clear to the Philippines government that this is unacceptable, that the case itself is unacceptable, never mind the outcome. I remember speaking to a European diplomat. After I was released, my 2 colleagues, Mohammed Fahmy and Bahar Mohammed, were still on trial. In fact, I was still on trial, but they were also back in Egypt. And I asked him what we should be doing, and he said, keep up the pressure, keep the journalists talking about it, keep it in the media, keep the press actions going. And I said, why? I said, because the Egyptian government doesn't care about this stuff. I don't care what journalists, Western journalists are saying. He said, no, they don't care, but I care. And as a diplomat, it helps me go into negotiations. It helps me go to the conversations that I'm having with my colleagues to say, I can't deal with you. I cannot normalize my relations with you until you resolve this because I'm under pressure. And so at all sorts of levels, the constant noise from journalists, from diplomats, from the public is really key to helping push back and defending Maria, and perhaps getting the government to reconsider and to change its ways, the Philippines government to change its ways when it comes to dealing with journalists.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, there's a question here from Marleya Muñez. I think Anne-Marie can answer this. She's asking, what is your message to students of journalism and communication at this time and with this case happening?
First of all, it's just something that's so amazing, Maritas and John, about this community that you've created right here tonight in Cambridge, this morning in Manila, around the world, is, as we can all see on the chat function and the questions, there really is, and this is to Peter's point, maybe this global conversation happening right now about this particular issue in this particular case. And it is quite extraordinary to see that. And I would say to students of journalism or anyone thinking about that, first of all, we need you. And second of all, there is this phenomenal community that you become a part of. And if these issues are important to you, and if that's your calling, as hard as the business is right now and as difficult as these challenges are, please join us. And this work is never done. I can't wait to see how the next generation combats these extraordinarily difficult issues, but combat them we need to do, and we need your energy, and we need your insights. I would also say that that is a generation that has grown up with social media and used it in a very different way than my generation did when I was in school, because it didn't exist. And I feel duty bound, and if Maria were part of this conversation, I'm hearing her voice in my ear. The role that Facebook has played in where we are today with these issues is something that she and Rappler have drawn very important attention to. And I think Maria sees them as effectively co-conspirators. That, there's this promulgation of hate content, that there's misinformation that goes uncorrected, that you can post and say and do whatever you want with impunity. And she and Rappler have reported and written and spoken about this very effectively and very powerfully. And to those students out there, these are your media. And we need you to help the rest of us figure this out and correct these problems, because I don't think democracy lasts in the way that we expect it to thrive if we continue down this path.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, John, just on that point from Anne-Marie, Anne-Marie's call to arms for journalism students. One of the things which Maria says to Amal and to I is that actually, if this was an attempt to silence her, it's had quite the opposite effect, because it tells her how powerful and how important her journalism is, and it makes her more determined than ever to stand up and tell stories and speak truth to power. And I've heard you, Peter, say something very similar about Egypt. I've heard my client Rana Rahimpour from BBC Persian, from the BBC World Service, every time she gets a threat from Iran, she thinks, this is why my job is important. It just reinforces why journalism is so critical, and it's entirely counterproductive. It's such a tactical blunder, because actually it makes people more determined to speak out, not less.
Thank you, Kealan. Just a time check. It's almost 9. We started 15 minutes late. Is it all right if we extend by 15 minutes? Would that be all right? So that would be 9:15 a.m. In the Philippines. My next question is for Chel. I'm actually grouping together, I think 3 or 4 questions, still having to do with legal outcomes. Chel, is it possible for Reynaldo Santos Jr., the co-accused, the former Rappler researcher writer, to receive a different sentence from Maria? Would Maria's dual citizenship factor in the sentencing in case they are found or they are convicted?
Let's talk about the outcomes first. This is something I didn't mention earlier. We have 3 accused here. You have Maria, you have Ray, and you have Rappler. And then the judge could actually, in theory at least, come out with different outcomes for each of them. The basis of Rappler's liability is the corporate liability provision in the cybercrime law. There are certain conditions there that may or may not apply, so the judge may say that Rappler is not liable. The basis for Maria's liability is not because she authored the article, but because of her position in Rappler. So again, the judge may say that she's not liable. As far as Ray is concerned, she could also say that he's not liable, even if he was the author of the article in question. See, the one thing that complicates this case a bit is that it's not about the original article itself. The original article came out before the cybercrime prevention law took effect. The only reason why this case happened at all and reached the court was because the article was republished by Rappler in 2014 without any change really substantially, except for the correction of spelling and so forth. So that is also an issue that we have been raising, the lawyers have been raising with the court from the beginning. But apparently our motions, at least the earlier motions, were not granted by the court. So there could be different outcomes. And as far as the penalties are concerned as well, it is theoretically possible that the penalties handed out, if ever there's convictions, will be different for the 3.
Thank you, Chel. Marites, do you have a question?
Yes, there is a question here. It's really asking, I don't know, anyone can answer, Anne-Marie, Peter, what can ordinary citizens do, non-journalists, during this time when press freedom is under attack? And as Anne-Marie said, it's democracy under attack. So what can ordinary citizens do? I think those watching are really interested in doing something. So who wants to answer this first? Peter.
I'll have a crack. I'll say a few things about this. When I was, quite a lot of people have said to me, asked me the same question, and particularly in our case, in my case, my colleagues, people were saying, what can we do to help? And what we've learned is, we were talking about Facebook a moment ago. We've learned about the destructive capacity of Facebook to promote misinformation and lies and so on. But we have also learned the incredible power of social media to move the dial. In our case, we the Free AJ Staff hashtag had something like 3 billion impressions. That's a phenomenal number. And it only happened because people recognized the significance of the issue and kept talking about it online, kept pushing the hashtag out. And even though it might feel like a drop in the ocean, billions of drops adds up to a noise that politicians simply cannot ignore. There is also more direct action that I would also encourage you. Again, people to write to their MPs, to their local members, to diplomats and politicians and so on, to make sure that they understand that this issue matters. And it doesn't, as we've been talking, without wanting to sound like I'm banging a drum, it matters not just within the Philippines, but internationally as well. And so we all need to be pushing this. I also think people ought to be supporting other press freedom organizations that are joining this fight. My own organization, the Alliance for Journalist Freedom, has been pushing for actively supporting Maria, but also lobbying our politicians and diplomats to make sure that they do the right thing. So all of this stuff does add up. It does make a difference. It might not feel like you're doing very much, particularly if it's, if it might feel like you're just retweeting. But please understand that these things do add up to a voice that politicians simply have to pay attention to.
To Peter's very good suggestions, I would add perhaps just one other thing, and that is subscribe. Subscribe, read, listen, watch credible, fact-based reporting. I think there's this, we have this idea that it's all kind of free because it's out there. You can read it on Twitter or Facebook or, Instagram or wherever. And the fact is that these are time-intensive, labor-intensive, really good reporting is time and labor and money-intensive activity. And so if you have the resources to subscribe, in particular to whatever your local resource is for fact-based journalism, please do so. If you have the resources, pay for other people's subscriptions. But if we don't support that kind of journalism while we still have it, it just increases the threat against it. So we need to be good consumers too.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. The next question is for Kealan. You've actually touched on this already, but might be good to go over this again. What can international defenders against threats to journalists do in Maria's case? And what exactly is Amal Clooney's role in the legal team?
So Amal and I jointly lead the International Council team. So we work together. We work with other lawyers. We've got two very brilliant other international barristers working with us, Jan Jiginsu and Claire Overman. And so we lead the international team together. On the other question, John, about what international defenders can do. So I presume it's a question about international human rights defenders, so NGOs. So to Peter's list earlier, I would add, as well as writing within the Philippines and getting people engaged, it's critical that you also, wherever you are around the world, and I know we've got an audience which is quite widely spread today, that you write to your own government, you write to your foreign secretary, and you urge them to raise this case in their bilateral relations with the Philippines. So wherever you are, whatever country you're in, if you're in Canada, if you're in a European country, if you're in another Asian country, if you're in Australia, you should say to your government, you have got to stand up and be counted in this case. You need to you need to raise your voice in your bilateral relations with the Philippines. In terms of NGOs directly, the press freedom community has been hugely supportive of Maria's case. And I think you will have seen that over the past few days. They have sent very clearly the message to the judge in this case that the world is watching. And we're hugely grateful to the International Federation of Journalists, to RSF, CPJ, ICFJ, to all of the organizations which have spoken out. And we want them to continue doing that because, as Peter and Anne-Marie have said, it's so critical that journalists in the Philippines know that they are not alone and that there is solidarity and support out there. And also, as Peter has said, it's got to be clear to those who are decision makers in these cases that the world is listening and the world is watching. And international human rights defenders have a huge role to play in ensuring that that message gets through.
Thank you.
There are two questions, short questions for Shell. Number one, just a technical question, I think. Why did the court, if the updating of the story didn't have anything to do with the substance, it's just changing a spelling, why was this considered by the court as probable cause? And the second is, this is really for a question about why does Duterte not censor instead of going through all these cases against Rappler? Why not do the simple job of censoring? So Shell, two questions for you.
There was a motion to quash that was filed on that basis by the defense counsels that was denied by the court. I don't recall the exact grounds, but I think that it's possible that the court is leaving that to the decision itself. That many of our trial courts here have a penchant for leaving issues like that to the decision itself. That we will have to see how she's going to treat that in the decision. I personally think that that should have been taken up and acted on positively in the motion to quash. But
I'm sorry, Chel.
yeah.
I'm sorry to break the news, but Howard Johnson of the BBC and Anjo Alimari of CNN Philippines have just tweeted, Manila court convicts Rappler CEO Maria Ressa of cyber libel. Also Reynaldo Santos Jr. and Rappler. Where does this leave us, Chel?
Well, that means, first of all, we need to know what the issue on bail is, how the court is going to treat bail. Right now, probably the defense is probably asking for the judge to grant bail pending appeal. Then in terms of the decision itself, the lawyers can file a motion for reconsideration within 15 days, still with the same court. If that is denied, then appeal to the higher courts. But the bigger issue, I think, now, and our main concern now is bail, whether the court will grant bail pending appeal to Maria and to Ray. And I really do hope that they do. I think that the weight of the law is in favor of granting them bail, particularly for this kind of case.
Thank you. Kealan, do you want to make a comment on the guilty verdicts?
Okay.
Sorry, I'm just in contact with the rest of the team. We obviously don't have any reasoning yet. We don't know what the sentence is. We simply know it's a guilty finding. So we're just going to have to keep an eye on it and see what's coming.
And
Thank you.
Shell, question, does the court grant permission to bail, or is it something that normally after a conviction, Attorney Ted Te and Rappler can post bail right away? Or do they have to ask permission from the court?
They have to ask permission from the court. Before conviction for a case like this, bail is automatic. They have a right to bail that cannot be denied. But after, because of the presumption of innocence, after conviction, that no longer holds. And there are certain criteria that the court will have to look at to decide whether bail should be granted or not. The main consideration really is probability of flight, which to me is nothing here. I don't think there's any probability of flight in this case as far as Maria and Ray are concerned.
There's
However,
yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead. There's an update here that permission to grant bail, it has been given. It's reported already.
It is discretionary, and I'm happy to hear that that was granted by the court.
It's 9:12. We'll be asking you for closing statements. We'll make one round. But I want to ask one more question for Chel. Chel, was it inordinately optimistic of us to expect a non-guilty verdict from a judge of the regional trial court?
Well, it's certainly optimistic to do that given the state of justice in our country. But at the same time, I think that this is not the end of it. Even as far as this case is concerned, there's still a long legal battle ahead, and there's a strong need for us to still generate a lot of public opinion, a lot of pressure on the government, on the courts, to look so very deeply into this case. As we've all been discussing in this last hour or so, the ramifications of this case really go deep into whether we can still call the country a real democracy. We've seen attacks on all the democratic institutions in the Philippines beginning in 2016. And this is just another attack that we have to resist and push back. And I think this should make us even more determined to continue the fight of speaking truth to power.
Thank you, Chel. I'll take that as your closing remarks. I'm going to ask Kealan, and then Anne-Marie, and then finally Peter for their closing statements. Kealan? Sorry.
I'm sorry, John, would you mind going to somebody else first?
Okay,
Thank
all
you.
right. Anne-Marie?
While you were talking, John, a message just came up on the chat from somebody that said, never give up. And we were just talking about that not 10 or 15 minutes ago, that no matter what happened, no matter what the verdict was in today's in the courtroom today, that this was not going to be over. We knew it was not going to be over no matter what the verdict was. That Maria and that Rappler were going to face a long battle either way. And the nature of the near-term battle has just been confirmed. But that is an invitation to us to double and triple our efforts, to stay as committed as we were, and to work as hard as we've been working on behalf of these issues. This is no time for retreat. This is no time for us to question our commitment to the basic principles and values that are also on trial here. And so my gratitude to Kealan and Shell and others who are working on behalf of this case, but also to everybody on this call today, to everybody who's been supporting Maria and Rappler in these efforts. Your strength and commitment are going to be needed more than ever now.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Kealan, please.
Thanks for bearing with me. I think you'll all understand. I was due to be in Manila, obviously, for this hearing, but because of coronavirus, I'm not. So just as it's come in, I'm obviously working. So just my apologies. Given the urgency, I've got to deal with it. But plainly here, what we've seen with a conviction in this case, we don't know the full details yet, but a conviction in itself is deeply concerning. And this is a very dark day for the rule of law and for freedom of expression in the Philippines. We have a situation where Maria Ressa has been convicted on baseless charges for an article she did not write under a draconian law which did not exist when the article was published. And frankly, this is an ugly stain on the Philippines' reputation. And the international community must condemn this grave attack on independent journalism and media freedom in the strongest terms.
Thank you, Kealan. Peter?
Yeah, John, I feel a bit sick, actually. I know that we've largely been anticipating this. We've certainly been talking in a way that suggests that we were all very aware that this was not just possible, but even likely. But it still doesn't make me feel any better. I still feel quite sick in the stomach to know that Maria's been convicted. And I think that, obviously there's some hope that there's some gratification, I suppose, if we can call it that she's been granted bail. But I think I'd like to really echo what Kealan just said, that this really is a time for everybody, particularly those of us who are not in the Philippines, to speak to our politicians and diplomats, to write to our members of parliament and our governments, our foreign ministries, to make it abundantly clear this is simply unacceptable, that this is a stain on press freedom, it's a violation of democratic principles, it's a rollback of democracy in the Philippines, that it has implications not just for the Philippines but for the region and the world more broadly, and particularly if we see anything less than an extremely robust response. This is important not because it's just about Rappler and Maria. This is, I think, a test case for the world's resolve in standing up to authoritarianism, to protecting the rule of law and press freedom more broadly. Certainly, my organisation, the Alliance for Journalist Freedom, is going to be speaking very, very robustly about this, and I'm sure that everyone else who is active in this space is going to be doing the same thing.
Thank you, Peter. I'm going to ask my co-moderator, would you like to say something at the end?
Oh no, I just want, of course, I share the views expressed earlier. I just wanted to thank you all for making time for this. Although it didn't end well, as John said, actually I was optimistic, inordinately optimistic. And so this comes as a shocking news to us. And as Shell said, I think this shows how the judiciary has not all, but a number of judges can't be considered independent in this very dangerous time. So that's all, John. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Of the many things I heard today, one of the most striking was what Kealan said when she described Daphne's case. Daphne saw it coming. The pattern was clear. There are some of us, and I was one of them, who did not think that the president would actually shut down ABS-CBN. He would not make the mistake of shutting down the largest TV network in the country. And I did not think that he would make the mistake of finding Maria Ressa guilty of cyber libel. And yet, here we are. So maybe the first task for us is to not deny reality anymore. We have to see the authoritarian regime for the monster that it is. And, to borrow Maria's famous line, to hold the line. Thank you, Peter, Anne-Marie, Chel, Kealan, and Marites. Hold the line.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, John. Thank you.
Hope to see you in better times.
Keep going, everyone.
Thank you.